There are some seats up in the front as well. So thank you, everyone, for attending Project 2049 Institute's event today, assessing the resiliency of the Chinese Communist Party. I'm pleased to introduce our president and CEO, Randy Shriver, and we're looking forward to our great experts and panelists today. And without further ado, I'll introduce Randy for some introductory remarks.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and welcome everybody. I'm delighted you all chose to attend this afternoon. I understand Think Tank Row is very busy here with competing events, so we're delighted you joined us. I am personally looking forward to this discussion. I myself have a lot more questions than answers, so in my introductory remarks, I don't plan on laying out any policy vision. I just want to help frame the questions that will follow here. We're all, of course, paying attention to the events coming up in Beijing associated with the 19th Party Congress, and a lot of questions about what may come out of that. But really, those questions are embedded in a larger set of questions and a larger issue about the strength and the health and the resiliency of the Chinese Communist Party. So we'll get through this party Congress. Xi Jinping will likely consolidate his power, but still the larger questions will loom about how healthy, how stable the party is. There are other questions that don't get discussed as often. I think a lot of people will give some assessment as to whether or not the party will last 5 years, 10 years, how healthy is it, but not as much discussion really about if not the CCP, then what comes next? What's the day after? If it's collapse or if it's evolution, what might China move toward? And so I'm particularly interested in hearing from panelists today that can talk about alternative futures and scenarios. Because if we go through that exercise and then we link back to U.S. policy, having been trained in the military, I think about strategy as starting with outcomes and thinking about optimal outcomes. We might think about possible tweaks to U.S. foreign policy if there are future scenarios out there that are more beneficial to the United States and what that might mean for how we approach the relationship with China today. And we have people that will talk about the Taiwan angle and the Chinese Communist Party, Japan, and we all have interests that are interwoven with the outcomes associated with this. So again, I myself have more questions than any particular policy pronouncements. But I think focusing on the health of the party and the resilience of the party is the first step, and we have a terrific panel. You know, there's the expression, he or she wrote the book on this subject. We have the person who wrote the book on this subject, Richard McGregor, the party. We have people that have actually thought about that second set of questions. What could the day after look like? We were joined by Yang Jianli, for example, who thinks a lot about that. The Chinese Communist Party invests a lot in ensuring that there are no alternatives, that civil society is weak and remains not cohesive. And so there are a lot of efforts to thwart planning for what comes after. But if we are of the belief that the Communist Party of China won't last in perpetuity, I think it behooves us, as no Communist Party has done, by the way, as of yet. The Soviet Union, I think, lasted 70 years. Maybe that's the record. So if they're not going to last in perpetuity, we should think about alternatives and what that means for our policies today. So again, more questions than answers from me, but I'm really looking forward to this discussion, really excited about the panelists that we have. And with that, happy to invite the first panel to take seats and get our program underway. Thank you.
Three panelists up here right now. We're missing one, so I'm also told I need to turn on my mic. But thank you, everyone, again for coming today. And this first panel is really going to assess the party, the resiliency of the party as it exists today, but also looking at its past practices and how how the international community currently interacts with the party, with China, with the PRC. So we have a really diverse group of experts up here to really kind of pull the party apart and assess different aspects of its power. The title of this panel is CCP Resiliency and the War Against Subversion. And I chose this panel title mainly because there's been a lot of human rights lawyers, a lot of activists who have been recently charged for subversion or have yet to be charged for subversion. And I kind of wanted to use this panel to assess why the CCP is, in my view, currently waging a war against subversion, in the country, with the 19th Party Congress coming up, I think, in 5 days-ish. It's everything that we're seeing in the news right now is how wonderful the party has been, all of these successes that China and the people of China and their communities have endured the last 5 years, and as they look forward to the next 5 years, they're championing a lot of their successes, which I think is great, and there are successes to be discussed. But I think this is also an opportunity for us to look into some of the fault lines and look into some of the areas where maybe they're not shining as bright as they make it seem to be. So without further ado, the first panelist I'd like to have speak is Richard McGregor. We know him as the author of The Party, but he also has a book that just came out and is I'll say it for you, but a book that just came out on Amazon. It's called Asia's Reckoning, China, Japan, and the Fate of U.S. Power in the Pacific Century. So I recommend everyone taking a look at this book. It's really incredible. He really dives deep into the history of China and Japan's relationship. But today he's going to be talking about the Chinese Communist Party, and with his assessment, looking at the strengths of the party, but also some of the challenges that they face moving forward. So, Richard, I think you have 12 minutes.
12 minutes. Turn that on. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Randy. Thank you, Rachel, for that plug. I don't have to do it myself now. On the resiliency of the party, I think one of the other panelists in particular is going to talk about that. I'm certainly of the view that I'm in the sort of resilient authoritarianism camp, I think, and I still am. As to the issue of whether the party collapses, all I would say was I would not want to be in China the day after, because as Randy says, the party covers all bases, and if the party does collapse, then in the immediate aftermath there would be a dangerous and very violent vacuum, and that's a real problem, of course, for anybody who wants to take them on. But let me just wind back a little bit. The issue of the party itself. When I wrote my book about a few years ago, there are actually many holes in my book. Luckily, nobody really noticed them. But if you do go back and look at the book, you'll find one thing that I got very badly wrong. And I talked about how China had, it's a hybrid market economy, a complex country, a complicated, big continental economy and the like, and that the idea of a strongman ruler was out of date. The sort of model we saw perfected or calcified under Hu Jintao, that is a kind of collective decision-making in the Politburo Standing Committee, seemed to be that the path China was taking. Of course, in about a very short 5 years, or even a year after he'd been in place, Xi Jinping proved that completely wrong. He has, as we all know, become the chairman of everything, from national security to economic policy. He has set up a whole sort of new national security system inside the party apparatus rather than the government. You probably have the weakest state council in a generation. Of course, the state council in the past has been crucial to the execution of policies, and one of China's strengths, frankly, has been the execution, experimentation and execution. He's overseen a massive reorganization and cleaning out of the military. He has, of course, also presided over a massive anti-graft campaign, which, of course, is part politics, but also part genuine house cleaning. He hasn't had all his people, his own loyalists in place in the propaganda system, but I think he's proved scary enough that they've behaved very well and worked in his favour at the same time. Now, that is the mega trend under Xi Jinping. Whether or not that's sustainable, I don't know, and I think I doubt it is. I don't think China after Xi Jinping is kind of like Russia after Putin, because China has a much deeper bureaucracy and a much sort of deeper sort of policy-making apparatus. But you don't have somebody as dominant as Xi Jinping in one term and maybe two terms, and possibly, and we don't know what's going to happen at the party congress, and then perhaps to muddy the waters on his succession. And I think that's quite dangerous in terms of Chinese governance going into the future. You don't have to have a sort of becalmed Politburo Standing Committee like you had or sort of paralysed decision-making process like you had under Hu Jintao, but by the same token to swing back to a much more sort of dictatorial, authoritarian style of leadership, I think is equally dangerous. I think in brief, the reason he's done this, I suspect that Xi Jinping looks back into recent Chinese history. He looks at leaders who've got things done, notably in a good and bad way, Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping. These are people who largely used authoritarian powers to cut through the bureaucracy right down to local levels to push things through. That's the first thing. The second big trend I think we see with the CCP at the moment is they're, if you like, coming in from the cold, or no longer hiding their light. The CCP, by tradition, is a highly secretive, opaque agency. It remains so today, but it's quite remarkable in the last 5 years how they've started to acknowledge their public role and, in fact, put a stamp on it very publicly. There's been Wang Qishan, I think about 6 months to a year ago, talked about how meaningless the difference between the party and the government was. And with statements like that really overturned 20, 30 years of what we might call Chinese-style constitutionalism, where we had a separation between the government and the party. So the separation between the government and party is basically disappearing or going even further into the rearview mirror. We might see one of the big tips out of the party congress is to see the party's anti-graft commission to be merged with the Bureau or Ministry of Supervision, which in some respects could be dressed up as a rule of law measure, but I really think is more accurately described as the party capturing the legal system more tightly. A third point on this issue, you might have seen recently how in Hong Kong listed companies, state-owned listed companies in Hong Kong, that the party functions have been written now into the Articles of Association within the companies themselves, so the party role now becomes much more explicit and open, in fact. And I think that's really quite a new frontier and a very interesting development. So there's no doubt that Xi Jinping has been a decisive risk-taking leader. I think there's always good to slightly qualify that by reminding people that when Hu Jintao took over China in 2002, China was maybe the 7th, 8th or 9th largest economy in the world. It had a much smaller military. It had much less capacity for action, much less capability. I think in many respects, Chinese policy has been very consistent over the years. Their aims have been very consistent. It's simply that China now has the means to chase them more aggressively, and Xi Jinping has certainly shown that he's been willing to do that. So that's Xi Jinping on politics, on national security, and on the military, a decisive risk-taking leader. When you come to the economy, I think it's a much different story, and maybe for a number of reasons. The record of economic reform under Xi Jinping has been much less clear and much less decisive than it has been in the political sphere. Now, if you're the party secretary in China, you have enormous amounts of executive power should you wish to yield it. which Xi Jinping has. When it comes to the economy, it doesn't matter who you are. You can't click your fingers and expect an economy to respond like a bunch of officials might in a second-tier city or in Shanghai or whatever. In other words, an autocratic style does not lend itself to economic policy making or economic reform. I know the word reform in China is a highly I don't want to say misused word, but it's generally used by people in the West as a proxy for liberalisation, and that's the sense that I'm using it in. So yes, Xi Jinping's style works in politics. It does not necessarily work in the economy. You will find people who say that Xi Jinping has subordinated economic reform in his first term to political consolidation. In other words, he's turning left to turn right, as they say in China. Such a sort of political style is, I think, familiar to most political cultures of leaders who solidify their base before using that foundation to pursue a different set of policies. But I don't really see that under Xi Jinping for a number of reasons. I don't think he believes in the sorts of economic reform that has been urged on him from outside and also inside China. And I also think if you look at how the economy and corporate structure is developing in China, you'll see that they're forging what they believe to be their own path, a quite distinct hybrid model of capitalism, which they intend to construct for themselves. Now, let me just go into some detail on that, on one of the issues that I've been working on in recent weeks, and that's about the Communist Party, Xi Jinping, and the private sector. Now, I know that when you define the private sector in China, it's not the same as Western private companies. They have a much greater involvement with the government. Many private companies take on state shareholders. They have so-called red hats to ensure that they can negotiate difficulties or call on the state for protection at different times. But generally, one of the great stories for the Communist Party has been the development of the private sector. I think it is about 75% of output now is private. If you look at the creation of jobs in urban areas in China, about 80% of that is private sector now. So in other words, the Communist Party is totally reliant on the private sector for economic growth and job creation, and is really joined at the hip with the private sector. So in that case, I think the party has been developing for some years, but in an accelerated fashion over the past 5 years, a way to manage and colonise the private sector to make sure it works to its benefit and to ensure that the entrepreneurial class does not become a rival centre of power, which of course is a key component of any Leninist system. Let me give you some examples of that. We had one even yesterday where there's a discussion of the party or the government taking shares in the BAT, Baidu, Alibaba and Tencent. In fact, these are monopoly private companies almost in their areas, but also exceptionally innovative as well. Their monopoly position has actually been very good for the Chinese government because they provide a kind of real-time, efficient digital intelligence service, which is an extraordinarily good feedback loop for the party and state security. But we've seen, if you look in the last 6 months or so, I think the party has been moving quietly to remind these companies about who's boss. Baidu had a scandal over the way they handled listings of health companies. Tencent had a few shots across their bow with one of their favourite online games. Both have been investigated, I think, in the last month over cybersecurity issues. In the last day, we hear talk about the government actually taking a shareholding in them to, in other words, say they would be much more closer to management. So in other words, this is one big step up from what the party had been doing for private companies, which was to put party committees inside so they had a presence. It seems now they want some kind of equity holding. I have 1 minute left. In fact, there was a document issued by the party and the government jointly about a month ago where they talked about the private sector and entrepreneurs, and in between praising entrepreneurs, they said the most important quality for entrepreneurs in China, number one, is patriotism. Xi Jinping himself said, he gave a speech on the private sector last year, and he said, business leaders should strengthen self-study, self-education, and self-improvement. He said they should not feel uncomfortable with this requirement. The Communist Party has similar, stricter requirements on its own leaders. So that's what I see as the big trend, is the merging of the party and the government, a more public role for the party, and a much tighter relationship between the party and the government and the private sector, which is driving the Chinese economy, and I think ultimately, which the success of China depends, that is a healthy economy, a high-tech, creating lots of jobs. So if you had to ask me whether the party in China is resilient, I would say so, extremely so at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. And I have one follow-up question for you, and I was wondering if you can kind of think back to when you wrote the book, The Party, and in your mind, where was there a flip where all of a sudden, Xi Jinping or other members of the Chinese Communist Party woke up one day and asked themselves, whoa, there is not enough party patriotism in the private sector. There's not enough party patriotism in the education area. There's not enough party patriotism in the general economy or the credit systems. What do you think there was some kind of flip where one day the party woke up and said, we don't have a handle, on this country. We don't have a handle on ourselves, and so now we have to take all of these, stricter measures on the party itself, but also on societies, on communities, and in the private sector. Could you talk a little bit about that?
I would say they wake up every morning thinking that, but I'll try and give you a couple of different ones. Obviously, with the issue of patriotism and education, that is post-89. The early 90s, which is when the patriotic education campaign really got underway in a concerted fashion, and you saw a lot more historical memories of the Sino-Japanese War memorials and the like built around China. That's that period. I think if you want to look at the private sector, I think it's obviously in the early 2000s with Jiang Zemin and the Three Represents campaign, which, of course, it's so clunky. It sounds so clunky. People laughed at it. But from a party perspective, I think it's been a highly successful campaign, because that was the official. The party has all these theorists, so-called, whose job it is to come up with slogans and ways to sort of square the circle with ideology and what's actually happening on the ground. And I think, They know their system better than us. They know the weaknesses much better than us. They know which holes they've got to plug better than us. I think in the economy, it's the dichotomy between an unproductive state sector and a productive private sector. And I think they crossed the Rubicon on that issue with the Three Represents campaign in the early 2000s. And that's when entrepreneurs were encouraged to join the party. And many entrepreneurs, I remember I spoke to about this at the time, found it very beneficial, to use that terrible phrase, win-win, because being members of the party actually helped them with access to bank loans, preferential access to land, etc., etc. Now, I don't know whether this is a kind of a perfect marriage which is going to have a very ugly divorce at some stage, but it's possible. I'll just say one more thing. As we all know, something that all officials must look at in China is they've got to sit down, and they've had to do this twice, and look at the history, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the lessons learned therein. That's one part of it. I think we often forget about the lesson which came after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that was the rise of the sort of robber baron oligarch class. And if that had happened in China, then PetroChina would be owned by a single person. Sinopec would be owned by a single person. So that's the second part of the lesson, I think, of the Soviet collapse, is the cannibalistic business class which grew up in Russia in its wake, and of course which attempted to get involved in politics and were only put down after a long, big fight.
Thank you. And I think you make a good point about the reach out to entrepreneurship. I think we've seen a lot of more activity from the United Front Work Department when it comes to entrepreneurship, when it comes to what they call the new social status, or looking at those who like the new like online ventures and startups that are beginning. I think you see a lot more activity with the United Front Work reaching out to those communities. So thank you. And with that, we're going to move over on to David Gitter, who's the director of the Party Watch Initiative, which is a program supported by the Project 2049 Institute. There should be a flyer out there for more information. The Party Watch Initiative just relaunched, and they had their first weekly output this week, and it's a really fantastic program that looks at different party organs. It looks at propaganda, it looks at the United Front Work system, it looks at discipline, and it's a really fantastic resource for China analysts to be able to kind of get a weekly look into what the party is saying and what they're doing. So I highly recommend everyone subscribe to the Party Watch Initiative, which information can be found at www.ccpwatch.org. But that's my second plug of the day. So David, Richard said that the CCP is very resilient, and one of the things that you're going to talk about is the role of the CCP propaganda in promoting regime resilience, which I think is a really nice transition over to you. So take it away.
All right. Well, thank you for that quick advertisement, Rachel. All right, so like Rachel said, I'm going to speak about the propaganda apparatus. The propaganda apparatus plays a very important role in promoting CCP resiliency. It complements that of other organs and apparatuses, namely those that deal with repression, the police forces, and also those that deal with implementing rule by law and rule by regulation. Its most important task is basically to unite all sectors of society underneath its rule, and really to sell the Chinese public on the concept that only the CCP has the authority and the right to rule China because of its ideology. At bottom line, the ideology is supposed to be infallible. It is supposed to be the only way that China can be understood, and no other group supposedly has the ability to do that. So that is what the propaganda apparatus must hit home at every single day. Since the 18th Party Congress, Xi Jinping has emphasized the connection between effective propaganda work and also party building and the party's governing capacity. Actually, since its first collective study session, that of the Politburo, Xi actually stated that some of the serious problems that are ongoing with party members at their root have to do with a loss of spirit and a confusion of faith, was the terms that he used. And what she was really getting out here is that even within the party, there is an ideological weakness that can be found. And he understands that without a cohort of committed believers inside the party itself eventually risks fragmentation and possible decline. Since in February 2016, as was well documented in Western media, Xi Jinping rolled out a bunch of new media policy guidelines that aim to make sure the party's media reflects the party's will, safeguards the party's authority, and also safeguards the party's unity. Similarly, propaganda textbooks speak about how if socialist ideology does not seize the propaganda work front, then capitalist ideology inevitably will. So you can get a sense from these official statements and writings that propaganda work is not considered a secondary field. It's really crucial to making sure the party remains in power. However, today, the party also realizes that this is just one method of remaining in power. It's only one method of securing the desired actions from the people. Today, the party also uses state laws and regulations much more effectively than it used to, but this is not its preferred route. It would much rather people do what they want because they actually believe in the party's ideology and they want to listen to the party. And the propaganda apparatus plays the role of making sure that the public's thought is unified in ways that are amenable to CCP rule. Recent propaganda guidelines divide propaganda work into three general tasks. The first one, as I stated, was transmitting the party's guiding ideology. The second one is to transmit policies and the CCP's line on various issues. And the third, the one I'm going to dig a little bit more into, is how it is supposed to educate the public, the masses, in patriotism, collectivism, and socialism. And this third task is crucially important because this is basically how the party reaches down from its theoretical heights to the individual citizen. At the core of this, in recent years, has been the socialist core value system. This is a system of national values that the party hopes every citizen has. They revolve around patriotism, traditional Chinese culture, harmony, and democracy as defined by the party. Xi Jinping has emphasized the importance of integrating socialist core values into every facet of society, into every citizen's mind, and it actually became a requirement this summer, or so it was reported, for movie theaters to actually play previews with socialist core value commercials featuring A-list actors before featured movies. So, this is basically what the party's trying to do with propaganda, and the question is, how is this all actually working out in reality? And to help answer that question, I'm going to draw on some observations I've made through my recent research, as well as through my recent summer trip to China this past July. And I'm also going to draw on some conclusions made by other scholars. First observation was made by the Global Times, and that is that many Chinese have actually begun to skip the movie previews before their featured films. That's a small fact, but I thought it was a little bit showing at how this is not very popular. Other observations I've made this summer, I spent 4 weeks in China in July, including in 4 different cities and 3 or 4 different days in the countryside, and almost without exception, I saw every single TV screen in a public space, every single blank spot on a wall was devoted to propaganda, and specifically the Socialist Core Values campaign. And the other thing that I noticed was that almost nobody seemed to look or care. I actually spoke to many Chinese about this, and they seemed to confirm the general consensus in the West is that these old forms of propaganda are really not effective anymore. Most Chinese avoid and really ignore these sorts of advertisements the way you or I might ignore graffiti on a wall. The third observation I wanted to make is that even though the propaganda apparatus has tried to update its propaganda to make it more palatable to the Chinese public and also to the party itself, so far its efforts to do this, I think, have fallen short. It has really focused on what they call new media formats, which really has to do with social media, using things like WeChat and even cartoons to kind of spread their ideological message in a format that they think is better and not as abrasive. But as far as I can tell, most Chinese continue to find these efforts to be, again, kind of boring and arrogant and not really relevant to their lives. And that's not only my observation. You can actually find instances of leaders of People's Daily and other newspapers that represent the party basically saying, yeah, we know our opinion work needs some work, and it's not very effective as it is. The other set of observations I wanted to make, really conclusions of another scholar, one that I respect very greatly, Professor Bruce Dixon over at George Washington University. He published a book in 2016 called The Dictator's Dilemma. And this book really dug deep into how Chinese see their government and how much they support the party. And he came to several interesting conclusions. I want to talk about a few of them here. First, the conventional wisdom that economic growth alone is a good indicator of support for the party was found not to be true. Instead, pocketbook factors such as whether a person's individual income has risen in recent years was a better indication of party support. And at the final survey time in 2014, Most Chinese continue to see their incomes rise over the past few years, and they expected their incomes to continue to rise for the next several years. So it's a bit dated, but I think that's telling. Second conclusion is something I think most of us probably agree with. The Chinese public strongly self-identifies with their country. They're very proud of their country's place in the world. And when people criticized China, many felt that they themselves were being criticized. And this confirms that the Chinese public basically is very nationalistic and very patriotic. Another conclusion, many people, in fact a majority of Chinese, fear instability as related to the possibility of having multiple opinions and multiple political parties inside China. Part of this, I think, is related to the recent history that even young people have heard about from their parents and grandparents, things like the Cultural Revolution. But I also think this points to the effectiveness of the propaganda apparatus, which really drives home the point every day that democracy can lead to chaos. And I think they've been very effective at hammering this message. Notwithstanding, most Chinese continue to see that their country is becoming increasingly, although gradually, democratic. This is really interesting and goes against conventional wisdom, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more. Again, that's not to say that Chinese people eventually do not want actual democracy in the future, but they are content to see improvement. The final observation that, Professor Dixon makes is that most CCP members that joined after 1992 joined because it was helpful to their career. So this might have always been the reason, but now it's the open reason, and they do not fear to list it. This reason beat out other answers such as serve the people, work for communism, and only the CCP can lead China to prosperity and power. Additional conclusions, most ordinary Chinese overwhelmingly see party members as joining for material self-interest, and most party members, those not at the top, are only slightly more supportive of the CCP regime than non-party members, which I think is very surprising. One more observation by two other scholars from Taiwan, Wang Xuancai and Peng Xiangkao. They did a paper back in 2013 on the CCP's commentary system, and they found that through their interviews, CCP members were also increasingly having negative reactions towards propaganda edicts sent down from above. In other words, they don't want to read their party's own propaganda or propagate it themselves in many instances. So, these facts really don't bode well for the party's future, I don't think. And to draw some of my own conclusions, I think that Xi Jinping has accurately assessed that there is really an ideological vacuum in Chinese society, but also in the party itself. I think that this is crucial that the party has to address this because, as I said, if all else falls, if the economy falls and if incomes fall, then the bottom line is that nobody else could do it better than us, right? So even though we're having these problems, we're all you got, and our ideology is the only ideology that can lead to a successful living standard and life in China. The second conclusion that I think is very apparent is that both traditional forms of propaganda and also updated forms of propaganda have failed to transmit this ideology and to make the average Chinese citizen believe it at their core. However, I do believe that propaganda played an important role in making sure that all Chinese are very patriotic, that they love their country. Although it's important to point out, again, this is not necessarily ideologically based, nevertheless, this to date has supported the CCP's resiliency, as also the concept that democracy can lead to chaos and falling living standards in China. In other words, peaceful evolution will not work, and the party remains the best bet. Now, the fact that, according to these surveys, most Chinese felt that China had increasing democracy, to me that, again, points to the success of the propaganda apparatus in both conflating the definition of democracy, potentially with that of consultation. The CCP has always had different mechanisms for consulting the masses and kind of spoon-feeding policies and their own ideas back to them in the form of the party line. But of course, this is not true democracy. However, I do think many Chinese may be confused about what democracy actually is. A final point I want to make with the time remaining is that the party should be very concerned with the fact that there is lackluster support among its ranks for its own rule. We see today that most party members join because they want to advance their careers, they want to advance their own self-interests, and that's becoming harder to do with Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaign. So it's becoming harder to cash in on their party membership, and the question remains, and maybe this is something the next panel can talk about as well, if there's a serious crisis or a serious democratic uprising in the future, can these members of the party be counted on by the leadership, or might they actually defect in some future scenario? So those are my comments. Thank you.
Thank you, David. And I had just like one follow-up, or just observation from your remarks that struck me, is the talk about socialist core values. And to me, that means that they're trying to build a platform and build a narrative that provides an alternative to Western values or Western core values. So how do you get the sense that when they say socialist core values, do you find that to be inherently different from the values of liberalism? And I just mean freedom of movement, freedom of expression, freedom to, as an academic, to write what you want to write and research what you would like to research and publish it freely without harassment. How do elements of that fit into the greater constructs of community and society in China?
Well, I think your question really kind of makes almost a comparison between the American dream and the China dream. The American dream, as you know, has to do with being able to advance your own life, to make your own decisions, to be free, right? To be able to stay and do what you want, to work how you want, and to live how you want. However, socialist core values, at least as I understand them, is meant to increase patriotism towards the goals that have already been set by the party. So we're talking about the China dream. We're talking about the successful creation of a moderately prosperous society by 2021, as well as by 2049, an advanced socialist, culturally powerful, rich country. And again, these goals are set out, right, by the party line and by Xi Jinping. So the role of the propaganda apparatus, and of course core socialist values, is to make sure each individual is marching towards this goal, not their own.
Thanks. I think that provides me a good transition over to my right with Ms. Nadège Roland, who is she's a senior fellow for political and security affairs at the National Bureau of Asian Research. And the reason why I actually set up this lineup of panelists is that I wanted to have Richard talk about kind of the party and where it's at today, and then have David go into the propaganda system and how the party permeates into society and communities within China, and then move to Nadège, who can really talk about the CCP policies and their needs and wants and how they take that abroad, and how it impacts the United States, how it impacts Southeast Asia, how it impacts Europe, and the people and the citizens within those countries. And so I've asked Nadège to talk a little bit about One Belt, One Road, and you've done so much great work on this already, but I hope that you'd be able to discuss OBOR, One Belt, One Road, as a political national strategy in efforts to cement CCP authority or to cement, socialist core values as a counter to Western values abroad, and be happy to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and thank you for the invitation. For those of you who are not familiar with Belt and Road, it was launched in 2013 by Xi Jinping, and it's supposed to help building infrastructure across Eurasia and link the rest of Eurasia to China through roads, ports, and railways, and eventually create a community of common destiny, or in other words, a form of regional integration under Beijing's helm. And you might be a little bit intrigued intrigued as I was by the topic of my presentation today, and think it's a bit of a stretch to see a possible correlation between the infrastructure building and the cementing the CCP authority. Well, I'm going to argue that cement is not the only thing in common between building infrastructure and CCP resilience. I will have three main points. First of all, just reminding what's the CCP's overarching objectives and the instruments that it used to achieve them. And second, how Belt and Road is helping to consolidate the party's position. And the third, because we're talking about resiliency, how it might not work. So first, I think all of us will agree that the main objective of the party is to ensure that it keeps monopoly over power. And for that, it used the three main instruments over the years to control the Chinese society. First is ideology, the second is repression, and the third is wealth. And each instrument has been used since the foundation of the PRC, with difference in their relative importance depending on the leader and the time. But now China mainly operates under a tacit social contract in which the population is expected not to have political demands in exchange for economic and development and prosperity. And I think that economic development, as David mentioned, and rising of income has also become one of the main pillars for CCP legitimacy in the last 2 decades. And under Xi Jinping, you still find the three main elements of control, but with some slight differences. So obviously repression and surveillance and control have increased. Ideology is still a prominent instrument of control as well, but of course it's not the Maoist revolutionary ideology anymore. It's more, it's been replaced by a very strong nationalism. A nationalism that shows a proud face, really. I think in that sense it's very different from the more victimhood that used to be the case before, or the humiliated face of the nationalism. So that proud face is all about this aspiration for China to become a great power, the achievements of becoming the second world economy, and now you feel like it's time to reclaim China's rightful place in the world, etc. And for the wealth, the third pillar of control, I think. Now it's become more difficult, and as Xi Jinping acknowledged in 2014, China is facing a new normal now. Economic growth with double digits is gone. So how do you deliver? How do you continue to maintain your legitimacy? How you continue to improve your people's lives? And realize the China dream that David alluded to, when you are a one-party state who wants to stay in power, who is facing a stagnating economy, regional disparities in economic development, possible social unrest that's also potentially threatening to your power. While at the same time you have those very big, ambitious aspirations about reestablishing yourself as the preponderant power for the region. So if you follow the path that all economists point to, you need to reform your economy. As Richard mentioned, you need to have an export-driven, consumer-driven and service-driven economy instead of export-driven, state-led. And that would require really losing your grip on power and control, and you would be very reluctant to do that. So you'd rather look for solutions that would allow you to maintain your grip and your state-led system instead. And that's when Belt and Road comes in. Belt and Road is really the one-fits-all answer to many of your most prominent quagmires as a one-party state. It answers your need for socio-economic stability, your nationalist goals, and your overall strategic objectives. Now let me explain a little bit how. Economically, thanks to Belt and Road, you can deal with some of the overcapacity that you have been creating with your stimulus package. in 2008 without having to cut off the SOEs or the heavy industries that employ so much of your population and your workforce. So you keep employment rates at an acceptable level, and therefore you maintain a reasonable level of social stability. You can also strengthen your SOE's position in emerging markets, and therefore you expand your markets, you foster your national champions internationally. You can start to internationalize your currency without having to relinquish control over your monetary policy because you sign swap agreements bilaterally in countries where you invest. So in all, you sort of maintain a state control over the economy. And in order to sustain your manufacturing, your industrial production, and therefore provide for that continuing economic growth, you also need to secure your energy imports and your access to natural resources. And you know that your dependence on imports is going to grow over the years, and you know also you have identified Russia and Central Asia as key areas for your national energy security supply base. And so Belt and Road will help you invest in those countries and sign energy deals and build more pipelines with these countries. At the same time, you want to secure your energy imports and build alternative routes to the ones that go through the South China Sea and the Indian Oceans that are under the US Navy civilians in control. The second thing that Belt and Road can help you with is domestically. You help reduce the development gap and disparities between your coastal provinces and your inner provinces, because you incorporate your western provinces into a broader trade and infrastructure network with your neighbors on the west. And you hope that promoting development and reducing poverty will help diminish the possible social unrest and discourage radicalization and terrorist recruitments, both within your borders and also within your neighbors and beyond. So all in all, you reduce your domestic development disparities, you reduce the risk of social unrest or even separatism. So that's a big trouble that you can check off the list. Internationally, thanks to Belt and Road, you raise your status as a great power, a provider of public goods. You take the lead of a global initiative that's widely recognized as having the potential for a far-reaching global impact. You gain international respect for doing this, for being such a generous country, open and forward-looking. So you feed the proud face of your nationalism. You articulate a vision for what you call the new phase of globalization that is necessary because the Western-led one has failed. And you create the impression that what you offer is the way of the future. You create a narrative that portrays your model of globalization as inclusive and peaceful, in stark contrast with the West's oppressive colonialism and military expansion. So basically, you push against Western models, more actively push forward a Chinese solution to the world's problems. Again, you feed your proud face of nationalism. In the meantime, by doing this, you also advocate for new norms, including development rights that you present as more important than human rights. You advocate for respect for development path of countries, implicitly rejecting democracy promotion or color revolutions that you see harmful for your own power. At the same time, you also consolidate your autocratic neighbors' own grip of power by giving them access to capital, to infrastructure, without demanding from them any progress on good governance or transparency or human rights. So in all, you limit the spread of democracy at your borders, and you reduce the risk of democratic contagion for yourself. So my third point is, obviously, every step of the way, things can go wrong and undermine the CCP resiliency. 2021, as David mentioned, is one of the 2 centenary goals. The CCP needs to deliver on this promise of having built a moderately prosperous society with a GDP and per capita income doubled from the levels of 2010. And so will Belt and Road help with that goal? This is a question mark. I don't have the answer to that. As the Belt and Road Initiative invests huge amount of money in countries where the return might be inexistent, how much of China's national wealth is going to be diverted overseas instead of being invested in education, social benefits, or health care? And what kind of cost will that impose on the Chinese society, and how resilient the society will be? That's another question to which I don't have any answer for. And finally, doesn't Belt and Road present some risks of overstretch for China, both regarding its own economy and also regarding the risks that this might imply for its assets? Can it be drawn into military conflicts or local insurgencies? That we don't know yet. So all in all, it sounds like Belt and Road is the winning trifecta for the CCP. If it works, it would be a total victory for the party, who could then rest on its laurels and as it approaches the 2049 centenary. But because the stakes are so high, the risks are also very, very high. I think China is also stepping outside of its comfort zone, outside of its borders, where the party doesn't have so much control, after all, over the outcomes. And so the success would mostly rest on how the recipient countries or the targeted countries react to China's plans. So there's an element of uncertainty here, and I think the party is probably not much comfortable with that uncertainty because they prefer control. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadege. I wanted to highlight one part of your remarks where you talk about how the party, through One Belt, One Road, pushes development rights as being more important than human rights, or working bilaterally with more autocratic countries. For example, like the ones that come off the top of my head or maybe Cambodia, or some of the investment actions that they're doing in Myanmar. And how does this idea of development rights is more important than human rights, what should the United States do to counter this type of strategy, and how does this narrative harm U.S. interests or interests of the EU in the region when it comes to One Belt, One Road? Because One Belt, One Road is not necessarily open to all countries or all private industries to be involved with it. It's a very, to me, it sounds like they're working bilaterally with different countries to, have these loans and to have these infrastructure development projects and to work on these ports. So I guess, what should the U.S. do? What does the EU do? And what does this mean for our U.S. interests and EU interests in the region vis-a-vis One Belt, One Road? Easy question.
Yeah. I was about to say. This is the $1 million question that we've been wrestling with in the last few months. It's true that, China is operating on a bilateral to bilateral level, so it's complicated to understand what's going on, and China is always going to be the most powerful actor in that transaction. So it's difficult, and if you come as Americans or Europeans and go to those countries and say, you need to be careful about governance, good governance and standards and transparency, I think most of those weaker countries that are in a very dire economic situation will say, okay, so now where's your money? Do you have something to invest in our country? Well, the Chinese have $300 million to help with building a road. And by the way, I'm an autocrat, so I'm going to put some in my own pocket. So I know how hard it is. I think to just counter that on a bilateral basis as well. I think for most of those countries, the choice is not very difficult to make, and also maybe they tend to see it as a short-term gain, not really looking beyond in the longer term, and the impact this might have on their own country. So I think one of the things that we should continue to do is abide by our own rules and provide an alternative, and maybe help also those countries with things that have to do with good governance. And I think in the long run, this is the only thing we can do. Another thing we could also do is, instead of looking at things in silos, maybe have a broader approach, and also have like-minded countries work together at a more multilateral level. I don't think we will be able to do anything, but also providing this alternative model that we have been building. Again, it's not something new for us. I think that China completely hijacked this idea that infrastructure is good for development. I have to remind you that after the Cold War, the UN and the EU and others have been pushing for the integration of Eurasia, also thanks to infrastructure. But we also came with the idea that a seamless infrastructure and trade would lead to economic development, and that would lead to more liberalization of the civil societies that would in turn demand more rights to their leaders and become more democratic in the end. That was the political endgame for those Western initiatives after the Cold War. So again, the project, the Belt and Road project, has nothing to do with that endpoint. Obviously not. So we need to. I think we need to continue to abide by our own ideas, our own values, and see where it goes.
Thank you. And I think just to add to that, there's something to be said that we see less and less countries. I see less and less countries, specifically in the EU, who call out on China on its human rights issues. One small study for me is looking at what's happening with Greece, Greece in the EU, and Greece really being one of the bodies that blocked a lot of the discussions on human rights in China. So I think seeing how One Belt, One Road and may lead to some of these changes, or looking at development rights, versus no more focus on human rights, is something that we should all kind of collectively think about and see what we want to do about it. So thank you for your thoughtful comments. And shifting over, Yang Jin Lee, I'm so happy that you're able to make it. And this is a panel, and this is a conference that's talking about the resiliency of the CCP, and it's talking about China. And there's only one person on this panel who's actually Chinese. So, Yang Jin Lee, I really welcome your thoughts, and he's the president and founder of the Initiatives for China, and I'm looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you. Hello. It's okay. It's working? Yeah. Okay. Thank you for the invitation. I'm really honored to be on the panel, but I have to rely on the PowerPoint to my presentation. The title of my presentation is Resiliency, China's Democracy Movement versus CCP. Okay. And first I want to lay down the foundation, the framework studying China's democracy movement. And I want to put forth 4 necessary conditions for the Chinese democracy movement to effect a real change in China. First is there must be general, robust discontent from people. And number 2, viable democratic opposition, overall viable democratic opposition. And then number 3, the split in the leadership in the CCP regime. And number 4, international recognition of the viable democratic opposition and the timely support when the moment comes. And we will focus on the viable democracy opposition. That's the things we should work on. These are duty to make it happen. So what is the characteristics of a viable democratic opposition? When can we call our democracy movement is viable, is sustainable? So there are a few conditions. Number one is there must be recognized mainstream organization or a coalition. And number two is a recognizable and relatively stable group of leaders that is capable of doing the following. Number one, it should be able to represent and be trusted by the general public. It must be trusted by the people, right? And to begin with. And number two, at least they should be able to alter the current political order, by which I mean you can call a strike, for example. And number three, they should be able to catch the attention and the support of the international community. And number four, which is very important, is they should be able to carry out or call off effective negotiations with the state. So they should be able to engage in political negotiations with the state. So this is a characteristics of a viable opposition. Then I want to use this framework to re-examine the Tiananmen democracy movement to see what we were lacking that time. Number one, first, general robust discontent from people. I think yes, I was there. And pursued democracy was not just a goal of a few dissidents. Actually, it's thousands of millions of Chinese people were demanding for democracy at that time. So I think for number one, a condition I should say yes, largely it's a yes. Number two, viable democratic opposition, yes and no. There's a question mark. I think we had opportunity to make it viable, but was not yet that yet. Number three, splitting in the leadership in the regime. Yes, that is a big yes. We all know that there was an obvious split between Zhao Ziyang and Li Peng. It's not only for the sake of a power struggle, it's for the sake of political ideas. So there was a clear division at that time. So there's a split in the leadership that time. And number four, international recognition and support. I put a question mark there because, the international communities, U.S. and other democracies came together condemning the slaughter of the government against the civilians. But none of them thought that was the moment. That's the moment of a revolution. So there's no further action to intervene, to support. Okay. Based on the memoirs by many involved with the movement, there could be a moment. So we missed the moment. So that's my re-examination of 1989 democracy movement to see what we are lacking. Okay. After that, the Tiananmen massacre creates a fear, a very strong sense of fear and dismay among the people. It also creates a sense of fear among the officials because the legitimacy was called into a big question. And after the disintegration of the Soviet Union bloc, even heavier cloud was cast on the heads of these officials. Everybody actually at that time was doubting how long we can fly our flag, how long we can fly. So definitely, China was in crisis, trying to break in the international, not containment, but contamination of, the difficult international relation situation. So, but largely due to Deng Xiaoping, who was very pragmatic leader in China, and he adopted very good policy for the Communist Party, and he took a very famous Southern China tour. After that, the officials of CCP of all levels soon realized the three realities. So number one, which is very important, The Chinese Communist Party's stay in power has nothing to do with the communist ideals. Number two, economic growth means everything. Actually, this is a major source of legitimacy. I didn't put another source of legitimacy, that is nationalism, which is also very important, but for some reason I didn't put there. Number three, in order, which is also very important, in order to uphold the one-party dictatorship, it had to rely on capitalizing on the dark and evil side of human nature, spoiling the elite in exchange for their loyalty. So actually, they reached a tacit agreement between the regime and the elite that whatever you want to do, go ahead, please, as long as you don't do anything opposed the regime. If remain loyal to the regime, that's okay. So after that, what happened, we all know. Fast economic growth, power and money, marriage, and including the foreign capitalists, open market, everything. Okay, in the past almost 30 years, China formed a two-China structure, two-player game. That's what China was before Xi Jinping assumed power. I gave a lot of talks about this. It's a two-China structure. One China is China Inc. It's crony capitalism. So I put there the description. It's over the 90s and the first 10 years of the 21st century. In China, power, political elite, capital, economic elite, including foreign business elite, and intellect, social and cultural elite were bonded together and formed an alliance that is maintaining the existing political power. That is China in the eyes of many people, especially in the international community, with a tremendous wealth that is dazzling the whole world. But there is another China, which I call China of China's citizens. I'm sorry for this term. I came up with the term with a real story, because there are many stories in China. They treat ordinary people as a shit. Actually, that's from a mouth of one party official. This is just a piece of shit in front of me. What you are? Okay, so the China of citizens consisted of 1 billion Chinese people who literally were laborers for this China Inc. That's the two-China structure before Xi Jinping assumed power. See what happened after he assumed power. See what he did. A anti-corruption campaign, of course, everybody know that. And why? There are a lot of analysis about why he came up with this campaign. First, of course, the corruption had become so serious. They could topple the whole regime anytime. So first of all, of course, he wanted to appeal to people's support. Number two, purge the challengers to his power, potential or real or imagined. So he used it to purge his challengers for a power struggle, for the sake of power struggle. Number three, which is rarely mentioned, that is the two-China ruling model became increasingly costly, almost unbearable with economic downturn, because economic growth continue to produce the middle class. The China government has to co-opt them, to absorb them into ruling structure. These people are so costly. So it's become unbearable. So the good days for Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao just ended before Xi Jinping assumed this power. Okay. And the number two thing he did is concentrate power in his hands. Everybody knows that. He became a paramount leader, even with a personal cult. And number three, which is also very important, that is what he wants to do. His new political line. He literally, step by step, but systematically enough to have a new era. This era of Deng Xiaoping, which is radically different from that of Deng Xiaoping and his followers, namely Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. So I think politically he will take a middle way of Mao and Deng. So Okay, of course, he further control over the civil society, overseeing a crackdown on the civil society in the scale as seen in the past 20 years. Okay, the effect. Then what happened? Then China become more ideological and less resilient. That's a key word for this panel discussion. I think CCP regime now become increasingly less resilient because it is more ideological, okay, and more dictatorial and less strong. Why is it less strong? I don't have time to elaborate. I think Xi Jinping, of course, he concentrates power in his hands, but he has all kinds of crises around him. And number three effect is elite alienated. Party officials have been spoiled by the crony capitalism. So now you want to take their cheese from them. You touch their pies. So although you see the officials pay him respect as paramount leader to the degree of a personal cult, but they don't have the passion. They don't have passion to vehemently support him. And most important thing is the middle class people, the private entrepreneurs are just turning their backs on this ruling regime, which, as I said, the Tiananmen, after Tiananmen's massacre, CCP could continue to its rule to this day because we rely on this power base, which include the middle class. Although there are a lot of protests, thousands of hundreds of thousands each year, but there's no big change because the middle class did not support. Now the middle class people are just turning their backs on this regime. And there is no social structure term really vehemently support this regime. Now let's come back to the four necessary conditions I just laid out and see what condition we are in. Number one, general robust discontent from people. Yes, existing. This regime does not lack enemies. Number two, viable democratic opposition, new development, new middle class people, private entrepreneurs, and even political elite may just come to us. But they are caught in between the ruling regime above and ordinary people in the bottom. But these three players, no trust among them. This is why I call this a three-player game. So what we should do is two coming together. So middle-class people coming together with ordinary people at the bottom, and the intellectuals like Liu Xiaobo or Liu Xiaobo Dai, this intellectual coming together with ordinary people. These two coming together will help us to form a viable opposition. I'm sorry, I finished. And the number three condition is split in the power. I think sooner or later will happen. I don't have time to elaborate. Number four, international support. I leave this topic to you guys. Thank you.
Thank you, Yanchi. So if it's okay with the audience, I'm going to extend this first panel until 3 o'clock instead of 2:55 to give you guys some time to ask our great panelists here some questions. So I'll take questions about 3 at a time, and if you can just say your name and your affiliation, that'd be great. We have some mics coming around too. Sir, in the back.
Hi, I'm Bill Snyder. Thanks very much. I think that was a great set of discussions. I think I see many faces I saw here yesterday, just upstairs for another event. And I'm curious, one of the presenters yesterday, Willie Lam, had laid out some pretty compelling arguments on why he believed, for example, Xi Jinping was at least going to make the case for staying beyond the normal 10-year term. In fact, he looked at 2032 as the most likely exit point, if not longer. So I'm curious to hear the panel's thoughts on that.
Do we have a second question? Without a second question, there we go.
I thank you. Yes. Thank you very much for the excellent panel. My question pertains more to Mr. Gitter's comments about the ideological component of propaganda. And I was wondering if there's this big spiritual kind of vision. Is there a priestly class? Because right now the main ideologue is like Wang Huning, but there's already a discussion that he's not going to stay on forever either. So where do these ideologues come from? Are they the very same people that implement the policies, or do they just dream them up and then there's other bureaucrats that flush it out? Thank you.
And do we have another question? Oh, hold on, wait for the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm more curious about we know that Go Gui, he was here a few days ago. I'm very curious about you guys. What do you think about his comments about Wang Qishan? So do you think his comments of the party is it correct or legit?
Great. I'll throw in a fourth question if there is one. Yes. Mark Stokes.
Thank you. Mark Stokes, Project 2049. If I could ask maybe Nadej, when you hear or read speeches or descriptions of One Belt, One Road, you hear the term a new global order that's included sometimes. I wonder if you can elaborate, what is meant by that, a new global order, and how it relates to One Belt, One Road?
Thank you. So the first question we have is Willie Lam making the case that Xi Jinping will stay on beyond 10 years, perhaps until 2032, and any panelists' thoughts on this subject. So, anyone? Okay, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, Xi Jinping has clearly showed his intention to go beyond the second term, go beyond the 10 years, limited by the former practice or norm. And I think at upcoming 19th Party Congress, there are a lot of goals he wants to achieve. This is the major goal. He wants to lay down a foundation, a power structure, so that that will make him easily to go beyond the second term. Then the question is, of course, he will meet resistance from his comrades, because breaking any norm will create excuses for others to use against him. And so the question, I think the good question is, what new mandate he will find for his continuation of power after 10 years? So what is the new mandate? Then we can talk about so many of them, scenarios. One, he may want to open up politically, maybe. I think everything goes smoothly for him, maybe he wants to open up a little bit. Have some kind of election. It's to be good. It looks good to be an elected dictatorship than just a dictator, right? The elected dictator better than just a dictator. I don't know how smoothly that will go for him in the 5 years. So then what is new mandate? I think maybe crisis could be serving that purpose. So what kind of crisis? External. Then fit in his theory that I think 2020, 2019, some kind of a military action against Taiwan or some other country else would be plausible.
And Richard?
Very quickly, I mean, it's obviously foolhardy to make any predictions, but she has clearly left the way open for him to stay on. Jiang Zemin stayed on well beyond the well beyond that age as party secretary. There's nothing in the party rules which says he can't do that. But I do think that certainly Xi Jinping has no rivals at the moment, but I think, frankly, if he does sort of anoint himself party secretary for life almost, I think at some stage there's got to be some big pushback It doesn't suit China. I don't think it suits the party's long-term interests to have somebody sit there. Xi Jinping's people make an argument that he shouldn't nominate a clear successor, because that clear successor would then become the sort of proxy target for him, and everybody would aim their criticism and attacks at that person. And so it's better to leave himself there, and he's thus able to absorb the attacks and repel them more easily. But I frankly think it's very dangerous, and at some stage or another we're going to see some major backlash. I'll say very quickly on the issue of Mr. Guo. I'm sort of losing track of what he's saying these days, but I do wish whatever documents he's got, he wouldn't sort of flush them down the toilet or whatever. You know, that seems to me a terrible waste.
And speak of Guo Wengui, Yang Zhenli, if you wanted to make some comments.
Okay. I want to talk about Guo Wengui in the framework I just laid out. The four necessary conditions. Number one, if you remember, is general, robust discontent from people. I think Guo Wengui, what he has been doing, help with that condition, right? To mobilize more people, is more dissatisfied with the government, even have hatred, resentment among the people against government actually are mounting. He helped with that trend. Number two, viable democratic opposition. No obvious effect from his what he is doing. Number three, splitting the in the leadership. I think he's trying to do that. We don't see clear result yet, but I think it's in the making. Wang Qishan, of course, is bear the brunt himself, and the information concerning HNA, Hainan Island, is verified by the Financial Times, the New York Times, is true about Wang Qishan's connection there. Itself could be used by anybody who is in power to bring Wang Qishan down. So I don't know what kind of process his revelation will set off, but we have not seen the result. But I think it played a very important role in help split the leadership on top. And number four, international support. We don't see any clear effect directly related to what is revolting. But for what he's doing, it's just for the first one and the third one. I think I'm very supportive of what he's doing. And I think the U.S. should, and us, the democracy movement, should do everything possible to protect him in the sense that he shouldn't be sent back to China. See, he, in the sense, he's a defector. He defected from the system. He wants to help the democratization in China. He wants to help the ordinary people. If U.S. and the Chinese democracy movement overseas cannot provide the protection that he needed to stay in this country, who will defect in the future to us? This is a serious question. So that's my comments.
Thank you. And to wrap up the last two questions, very, very quickly, if you could do it in like 45 seconds. David, the question was about the ideological component of the propaganda system, and where do the ideologues come from?
Well, I think in the, if you're talking about a new priestly class, I think Xi Jinping is the Pope. But I think what Xi Jinping really would like to see is every party secretary at every level take on the ideological responsibility of ensuring their local area has their ideology down. I think that's also the responsibility of every citizen in Xi Jinping's view. And again, that relates back to socialist core values as well. So I think it's a lot about self-regulation, making sure every citizen and every party secretary knows their own duty in implementing the ideology as defined by Xi Jinping, and leaving no room for any other ideology.
And Nadej, your thoughts on a new global order?
45 seconds.
40.
Yeah, there's no fixed answer to that. It's just that the the new concept or conception of this new world order, as viewed by the Chinese, is still being built, and it's still being debated. I think there are two things I want to say. One is that China has been more vocal, also at the very top official level, about the deficiencies of this current order, and the need to reform it to give other countries other than the US and the Western countries more say. And I don't think that more voting seats in any international institution will be enough for China. I think what the intellectual elites are trying to mold is a new vision and a new model that will have nothing to do. It has to be essentially Chinese, and so it won't be anything like the world we know or the worldview we have. I think they're trying to look back in their own past, and I think it's very much influenced by their own diplomatic tradition. And so for us, I think it's difficult to really apprehend because it's so foreign. But I think you could get a sense of what this might be if you look at the choreography around the Belt and Road Forum in Beijing. How, in the old days, people would come to the emperor and give gifts, and the emperor would give them gifts in exchange. Well, here you didn't have silk or gold. You had contracts and MOUs and promises of loans. I think this is something that at the symbolic level was extremely strong, and will continue to be that way. So yeah, I'll stop here.
Thank you. And would like to relieve my panel for a second because I've had them up here for over an hour. But I just hope that you guys leave this panel as we transition to our second one with a few questions in mind. Just how when United States, actions in United States interest in the region, and what happens when you interact with the CCP, or when you interact with a stronger CCP that has more prongs in society, more prongs in the economy, in businesses, in private businesses, in tech companies, and how does the Western world or America move forward in trying to interact in this new space in the Asia Pacific region with the CCP that is growing stronger, that is trying to fine tune its ideology, that's fine tuning its propaganda system, and how do we want to interact with that type of system, and how should we interact with that type of system? And I think those are good questions to ask yourself. So please thank my esteemed colleagues and experts up here on the stage, and then I welcome our second panel with Emily David, Peter Mattis, Mark Stokes, and Kuniko Ishiwasa.
Ready. Much for spending your afternoon with us. I would like to welcome you to our second panel today, which is Future Scenario and Asia Without the CCP, ? For myself, my name is Emily David, and I'm a fellow with the Project 2049 Institute, and I'm honored to be moderating such a distinguished group of panelists here today. While the previous panel evaluated the past and present resiliency of the CCP with which we interact today, this panel will assess what a potential future CCP collapse could mean for the United States and for the Asia-Pacific region more broadly. Although this outcome is very unlikely, we, as the Project 2049 Institute, feel that part of our role as a think tank and a research institute is to participate in thought experiments such as this, to explore all possible contingencies. And ultimately, we hope this will successfully fulfill our mission as an organization, which is to guide decision makers toward a more secure Asia by 2049. So in our discussion today, we will hear from Peter Mattis, a fellow in the China program at the Jamestown Foundation, Mark Stokes, the executive director of the Project 2049 Institute, and Kuniko Ashizawa, who is an adjunct professor at American University. So without further ado, let's just get started. I'm pleased to welcome Peter Mattis. You have 12 minutes.
Thank you to Project 2049 for having me to DC. It's nice to come out and see all of you and many of the good friends in the audience. I wasn't exactly addressed to see China without the CCP, but I think what I'm addressing is key to a China ever not having the CCP. Since it's what does it mean that the PLA and the MSS and the MPS are essentially armed wings of the party, and before we can talk about this, I think you have to start at the party itself, not focusing on the PLA or the MPS, but and there's something worth going back to. If you remember Mao Zedong saying something about the Chinese Revolution, that the reason why the party won is because of three sort of magical weapons, as he put it. One was party building or party management, the second was united front work, and the third was armed struggle. And there's a very nice quote here from Mao Zedong that explains exactly the relationship. That party management is about essentially strengthening the warrior who wields the united front and armed struggle as a weapon against the enemy. And this means that you have to look at the united front, the armed struggle wings, and the party management as being interrelated concepts that are fundamental to the way the party functions. And as a little bit of a thought experiment coming off of some conversations, tried to do a little organizational chart of the CCP, sort of like what are the top level organizations belonging to the party itself. Forget who the leadership are, but in the party sort of organizational chart, what comes up top. And what I think when you see here is that you have a significant part of the party that is devoted to those three magic weapons, and a very small part of it which is actually devoted to much governing. And depending how you feel about the National People's Congress, you can consider that a vicious sin of omission. But I think this is a fairly adequate one. And the interesting thing about the PLA here is that pretty much every single party function is duplicated inside the People's Liberation Army. It is almost like a reserve for the rest of the party, or sort of the final piece of it. If all else fails, there's this hardened core or a backbone within the party. What I think this means in a simple way is that the CCP is a security organization. And you can say that I'm being a little bit picky here, but on the next slide, I'm sorry, this one's a bit smaller on the text, but these were organizations picked out by state media in covering Xi Jinping's speech in 2015 about the political core and the reason why the rest of the party needed to deal with the core. And when the sort of the text says all of the key organizations of the CCP were represented here, these were the only ones specifically identified by name. The Politburo, the Central Commission for Discipline Inspection, the General Office, the Propaganda Department, the Organization Department, the United Front Work Department, the Political Legal Commission, the People's Liberation Army, and mass organizations which all report to either a Politburo Standing Committee member, or the United Front Work Department. And then the rest was just sort of, other party institutions that are okay. And I think when you see this, again, you see you see the CCP as a security organization, not one that's a political party devoted to governing, generating policy ideas, but it's one that is both shaping itself and shaping the outside world. I think it's also interesting if any of you have seen the graphic about the Politburo that was put out by the Harvard Fairbanks Center today. It's a wonderful little circle. It looks very pretty, and it covers where all of the Politburo people are on different party functions. And almost all of the Politburo people are over in economic affairs and some other sort of governing policy type things. And all of the people that are governing these really aren't necessarily at the center of power. Most of these lead directly to the central leadership core, meaning Xi Jinping, Wang Qishan, and that's kind of about, and Yu Zhengsheng. So what I think that this is that these security organizations serve the top level leader. And that means that these are the instruments through which power is exercised and power is demonstrated, and for which power is competed. So the next obvious thing to think about this is, how does the party view security? And I'll pick on Richard because he presented. I never refer to the National Security Commission by its official English translation. I refer to it as the Central State Security Commission, because whenever we say national security, it brings to mind what we talk about in the West as being national security, which is a sort of a threat to the nation state from an external actor. Occasionally that includes subversion, but that's not really what most Western countries think about as being security. Under Xi Jinping's comprehensive security concept, he's really sort of framing in a very nice way exactly what the party has thought all along, that potential adversaries are not just outside China, they're not just outside the party, they're basically anyone outside the leadership. Security is about social order and party management. And that's why things like the propaganda department, the organization department, the political legal commission, the PLA, are so important to have at the core. So to start to get to the question of what does it mean that the PLA is the party's armed force, it means that the regime's survival depends upon where the PLA stands. And in terms of dealing with the things that we talk about often in DC, about what does it mean that the PLA is modernizing, how does this affect Western interests, the big point of this is simply that modernization will only continue so long as political control over the PLA is assured. And people want to say, well, oh, the PLA is simply loyal to the party and that's the way it goes. But we forget that there were group army commanders in 1989 who did not follow orders and who did stand aside or avoid following through on the orders to go into Beijing and execute martial law. And it's very telling that there's an op-ed in the PLA Daily in June or early July of 1989 that comes from, I think, the party, sort of the general office of the CCP. And it says something along the lines of, the party center understands that you didn't have to go shoot the people. It doesn't really say shoot the people, but that you didn't have to stand by the party in its time of need. But we thank you anyway because you stood at this critical moment, and this was a moment of life or death for the party. And when you look at other countries that have fallen, whether it's sort of the collapse of the Soviet Union, whether it's the collapse of Egypt, these are places where the armies more or less stood aside and said, we're not going to be party to this thing. So with all due respect to the others in the previous panel who says it's about discontent or other things, the key question of whether or not the CCP survives or falls is whether the PLA is willing to shoot the people again. For the MPS and MSS, the obvious question is, well, wait a minute, why are these state council organizations if they're meant to serve the party? And it's sort of a weird, abstract concept within the way the party and the state interact with each other. That goes back to the legacy of terror in the 30s under the Social Affairs Department, and when the MPS was not really the MPS, but sort of a political protection bureau in the red areas, or controlled by the Communist Party during the revolution. And it's that when they had a KGB-like organization with the power of the KGB, they ended up with what the KGB produced, which is bloody power struggles occurring at lower levels that essentially pit the security people versus the party secretary. And that kind of score settling when you're trying to win a war is not really what you're going for. And the final straw was the Cultural Revolution, in which the abuse of counterespionage charges and other sort of counterintelligence related things were used to purge the party. And it was decided in 1983 with the creation of the Ministry of State Security that things like counterespionage were not sort of ideological problems or thought problems, but they had to be based on concrete acts, meaning that someone actually had to transport documents or commit treason. But the noticeable thing about the MSS and the MPS is there is no state council body that has the authority to order the MSS or the MPS to do anything. It's only the political legal commissions, and now perhaps to some extent the Central State Security Commission and its substructure that goes to provincial and municipal levels. And what that's really doing is creating a system of systems for security organizations, and that doesn't give anyone clear power and authority to use those security services to purge each other. And since it's not about a sort of a thought crime anymore, they've become even more a tool of the party against outsiders, even though they are sometimes used for political infighting. So what this means to me is to simply reiterate that the future of China depends in many respects on the security apparatus and its loyalty and its effectiveness. And there is a tremendous amount of modernization and change that has been going on, and it's been going on not since Xi Jinping came through, not since Zhou Yongkang was head of the Central Political Security Commission, anything else, but it goes back into the 1990s and the sort of the modernization of the police forces, expansion of domestic intelligence, the integration of this with social credit, and I really can't do justice even to the short China Brief article by Samantha Hoffman that was published in August about social credit and state security. But she's submitted her dissertation that really takes all of these things and puts them together in a coherent way. So stay tuned and watch for that one when it becomes available. We should be asking a lot more questions about about sort of the nuts and bolts of the security services, because yes, the PLA is the final arbiter. If they're unwilling to shoot when that day comes, if that day comes, then the party will fall. Everything else in the security apparatus, from the Ministry of State Security, the Ministry of Public Security, the People's Armed Police, is about ensuring that that day of judgment never comes where anyone is ever given the power in the PLA to say whether the party will stay in power or whether it will fall. And it's trying to create a buffer so that that challenge can never be put to the test again. The second point is that we talk a lot about sort of the institutionalization of party politics, or institutionalization of the PLA, or the modernization and professionalization of it. And yet if we say the PLA is a, just like the rest of the party, then it has all of the same divisions and hatreds and pettiness that the rest of the party has. And if we say that there's simply a block within this system, then you have 2% of the party with 20% of the central committee. And part of that institutionalization argument is intra-party democracy. So that means that the PLA is now the largest block of coherent people. So no matter which way you believe Chinese politics is going, whether it's a personalized, factional sort of power scrum, or whether you believe it's being institutionalized, things like the PLA are in fact core institutions that determine how power and politics are done within the party.
Well, thank you, Peter, for that great review of the role of the party in the security apparatus, including the PLA, the MSS, and the MPS. I was hoping to have you expand a bit more upon your point that the key question of resiliency of the CCP resides in the loyalty of the MPS, MMS, and the PLA, and I was wondering what your thoughts are on whether the CCP will be able, sorry about that, whether the CCP will be able to maintain that loyalty.
I think that's one of those questions that is almost impossible to answer, because I think you have to look at it that way simply because it's it's the way governments rise and fall. And you don't know what it's going to look like until that day comes. Who would have predicted in January, in the days leading up to January 2011, that the Egyptian military was actually going to leave Mubarak out to dry? And what's interesting is that as events started to spiral in Egypt, the Egyptian military kept trying to tell outsiders that, look, we're not the Egyptian military before. Mubarak is on his own. If it's not resolved by police and it's not resolved by the politics, we're not coming in to save it. And a lot of people didn't really pay attention to those signals that were coming out, including some of the Western governments that were being told by their former classmates at war colleges and at defense academies. And we don't have that kind of relationship with the PLA to understand and ask those questions, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to be digging at why are their loyalty campaigns, why are they focused in particular areas. It is interesting that the loyalty and anti-corruption drive is focused on the parts of the PLA that are actually most important for internal stability. They're the ones that are plugged into the state security commissions at local levels, the defense mobilization committees, some of the logistical commands. They're tucked right into those places. And it's not a coincidence that these are the places that are being investigated most thoroughly for anti-corruption and loyalty testing to ensure that they're part of this.
That's a great point. Thank you very much for your remarks. So if the CCP is not able to maintain the loyalty of the PLA and the security apparatus, we would be interested to see what might be the role of Taiwan in such a CCP collapse scenario. So with that, we will move over to Mark Stokes, who will give us his thoughts on that topic.
Thank you, Emily. You've given me a very difficult challenge. In terms of, I was tasked today to discuss the role of Taiwan in Chinese Communist Party resilience or collapse, and it is a difficult subject. I see a lot of familiar faces here from yesterday. I was in Dr. Pillsbury. Welcome, thank you, Bill, and a range of others here. Yesterday, I gave a very detailed presentation on China's missile forces and joint intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, and very detailed, down the weeds, military unit cover designations and things like that. So you may wonder, so why in the world would, I'm a retired Air Force officer, why would I be talking about something that's very political in nature? And there is at least one reason. In the military, it's not unusual. Matter of fact, it's a norm to be able to get in and think about contingencies that could happen that probably have a very small chance of ever happening, but still there's time and resources that are invested into thinking through what U.S. could do or should do. Just that if something happens, that you just be a little bit more ready and prepared to deal with it. And that certainly applies here to a collapse scenario, some sort of catastrophic collapse of central order in Beijing and throughout the country. And what's Taiwan's role, which makes it even more complicated? And thinking through this, I would offer that there are 5 aspects or 5 roles that Taiwan could play. Taiwan as model, Taiwan as scapegoat, Taiwan as stakeholder, Taiwan as stabilizer, Taiwan as partner. So let me run through these 5. Let's start with Taiwan as model, or let's say Taiwan as influencer. Taiwan has long functioned as, particularly since its transformation into a democracy, has functioned as a model for other Chinese cultural democracies, or for other Chinese states that have significant amounts of Chinese culture. Taiwan belies the narrative that Beijing sometimes presents that Chinese culture is inconsistent with democracy. Certainly, Taiwan has significant Chinese culture, and there's a lot of shared issues on that front. I would cite, I don't have the exact citation, but members of Charter 8 who outlined that highlighted Taiwan as a model and hope that Taiwan's democracy continues to succeed and thrive because of what it represents as a potential for China. Taiwan also, in terms of an influencer, I think what's often missed, I see Russell here. I think Russell published something a few years back that talked about a question that we asked in the office a while ago is how much of China's GDP could be attributed to Taiwanese invested enterprises? It's a difficult answer to think about, but if you do think about it a bit, it can be fairly significant, particularly in certain provinces like Jiangsu, maybe, or Zhejiang. Look at Taiwan's role in terms of technology policy, science technology policy, early 1990s. There's been some fairly decent work on this. Taiwan, in general, could arguably be one of the most important outside players in the idea of sustained economic growth that China's been enjoying. A significant driver, not the only one, but significant driver. So that's Taiwan as a model or influencer. Let's look at Taiwan as a scapegoat in a collapse scenario, or in the events that could lead up to a collapse scenario. There's a long-standing narrative that domestic instability could drive Beijing to blame outside elements. And Taiwan, of course, would probably rank number one. Another narrative, possible channeling of internal instability to the outside, to be able to participate, for example, use of force. Now, bear in mind, when you start talking about use of force in the event of chaos inside China, or without chaos inside China, use of force would carry significant risks. I would highlight, is Ian around here? In Ian's book, I think, mentioned the notion that if there was some sort of an amphibious invasion attempt, and that attempt failed, there are significant risks for the Chinese Communist Party in terms of stability. Significant. And so that's another aspect. Taiwan as a scapegoat. Let's look at Taiwan as a stakeholder. If there was a collapse of central order in China, the effects on Taiwan would be significant, to say the least. I'm not sure if there are confirmed estimates of Taiwanese investments inside China, but they can range anywhere from, let's say, 100 billion, 150 billion, if not upwards from that. That's significant in terms of Taiwan's economy. There are an estimated, and these range anywhere, for example, 1 million Taiwanese that are in China at any given time and upwards. When you think about some of the conditions that would be some of the problems that would be occurring, evacuations, of course, would be a number one consideration. So let's look at the third. Taiwan is a stabilizer in a collapse scenario. The Tsai administration, Tsai Ing-wen administration, or Tsai Ing-wen herself in her inaugural address last year, said something very interesting, something I didn't expect, but it was, in my view, a significant session whenever she publicly highlighted that cross-strait relations, this is her statement, cross-strait relations would be governed, or at least would be informed by the ROC Constitution, Republic of China Constitution, and the Act governing relations across the Taiwan Strait or between the Taiwan area and mainland area. This was a significant concession, something I just didn't quite expect. Implicitly, this is kind of a form of a one China policy. And it makes you wonder why the complaints and why the pressure on the Tsai administration to adopt the so-called 92 consensus, which in effect is a one China principle whenever this statement has already been made. Or these referencing the ROC Constitution and the law governing relations across the Taiwan Strait. Major concession. It begs the question, when you start looking at the policy, it begs the question is what are the legal implications for the ROC in the event of a catastrophic failure of governance inside China? I mean, what actually is Taiwan's role in with this taking place? Difficult to say. Obviously, would be so much going on. It would be difficult to be able to figure out exactly what would be the priorities. I could offer one priority to think about. Let's say, for example, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, top concerns included the security of fissile material, nuclear fissile material, and nuclear warheads. That was the number one of the major concerns, at least from the international community, on what to do about these. In this particular case, what countries or what governments on the outside would be positioned and acceptable perhaps to varying parties inside whatever sort of governing structures would exist within China would have the type of relationship, the special relationship that would exist to be able to go in and secure some of these, work with whatever parties are in place to be able to work with these organizations. The United States, I doubt it. Russia, probably not France, UK, India, maybe some sort of a UN commission. India, Kazakhstan. I think this is arguably a unique role that Taiwan could play in worst case scenarios, and there probably are a lot of others. But it puts this issue of one China, this sort of a Taiwan one China or ROC one China principle, in a new light, and whether it's in the event of a collapse scenario, whether it's moving in the future, let's say 10 years down the road, an opportunity for some sort of a legal and permanent separation of Taiwan, or our value in maintaining some semblance of a one China, of some loosely defined one China principle. Let's look at the last aspect. Taiwan is partner. This is where we get sort of on the U.S. side. Implications for U.S. policy. The U.S. has long had a one China policy in one form or another. Very, very different from the KMT's one China principle, or whatever one China principle exists in Taiwan today. Certainly different from the CCP's one China principle. And I think former Assistant Secretary of State Jim Kelly outlined this, I think, in a very articulate way back in 2005 when asked, what is our one China policy? And he replied, I don't know if I can tell you. I don't know. But I can tell you what it's not. It is not Beijing's one China principle. And I thought that was I thought that was a very well prepared, well, probably not well prepared. I thought that was a very honest remark. U.S. has had a one China policy, arguably since, in one form or another, since the 1940s. And it's interesting when you look back through some of the declassified National Security Council meeting minutes from the 1950s, 1960s, on this one China, on the one China issue. It's some fascinating findings. There appeared to be, in the late 1950s, a move afoot, possibly to actually recognize Taiwan as Taiwan, and in terms of a way to be able to normalize relations with PRC, maybe recognizing Taiwan as Taiwan and then PRC as PRC. Interestingly enough, their record of some opposition to this for an interesting reason, and it had to do with this idea of a collapse scenario. Something, or at least to put pressure on the Chinese Communist Party by having an alternate that's out there to be able to provide, at least in the future, at least some expectation that the ROC would eventually evolve into a democracy, which it did. Some alternative answer to what the CCP offers Chinese people today, or at that particular time. At that particular juncture in time, there was an advocacy for having as normal of a relationship with both sides of the Taiwan Strait as possible. This is the origins of what was eventually referred to as one China, a U.S. one China, two governments policy. Sometimes it's mistakenly referred to as one country, two governments, but one China would be a more accurate description because it's because of the idea of sort of the ambiguity in defining what exactly China is. The closest the United States ever came to having a one China, two governments policy was between 1972 and 1979. The Nixon administration, after the 72 communique, never did break relations with the ROC. That took another, it took another several years until 1979. We had an embassy in Taipei. We had a formal representative office in Beijing. We had 2 presidential level visits to Beijing. We had a vice president visit to Taipei. It wasn't until 1979 that the U.S. went back to what in effect is a zero-sum approach to be able to defining one China. In the beginning, probably not an issue because both sides were autocratic. There were autocratic governments on both sides. The ROC of today is very different than the way it was before. The ROC it now enjoys popular sovereignty. And in effect, with the U.S. with the One China policy, the U.S. Extends legitimacy to the Chinese Communist Party, if you define it in a zero-sum game, and withholds legitimacy from an ROC that has emerged as a open society. And in effect, in this way, U.S. extends legitimacy. It helps to legitimize and actually enhance CCP resiliency, because Beijing most certainly views this cross-strait dynamics in a zero-sum fashion. It views it where if the U.S. does anything to be able to extend legitimacy of the ROC, whether it's sending a assistant secretary of state, or whether it's a port call of a ship, for sailors to go out and have fun. Anything, any additional legitimacy that's extended to Taiwan is, in their view, it takes away from the only legitimacy that they have. I don't have all the answers for you, but in my view, it's these kinds of issues that puts both the U.S. One China policy in a different light, as well as others. And so I'll leave it there. And sorry, I went over time a little bit.
Thanks, Mark, for that great overview of 5 potential roles for Taiwan in a future CCP collapse scenario. One question that came to mind was, I was wondering if you could answer, what should U.S. policy be in cross-strait relations?
Well, I can speak to it in more broadly. I would say the first step really to take is a better understanding, I would say, just within the American domestic polity, the ability to separate objective reality from a narrative, or from a policy. The objective reality is that Taiwan, under its current Republic of China Constitution, exists as an independent sovereign state. Anybody who's lived in both Beijing and Taipei, I think, it's clear. However, this is different than the idea of how you deal with it and how you recognize it or not. And if a one China narrative is useful, then keep with it. So beyond just simply understanding the difference between objective reality and policy, it's just to think through these issues of why the U.S. would want to think back and look at the history, and whether it's from 1960s or early 70s, why it would be in the U.S. interest to at least consider an idea of moving toward a more balanced relationship with both sides of the Taiwan Strait. And I would argue, look at it in the context of what ways could the U.S. One China policy be broadened? In a very careful way. Arguably, there are 3 reasons off the top of my head. One is simply the objective reality. If U.S. policy is not based upon objective reality, you're going to have problems with this sort of ambiguity. And so, just simply based on objective reality. Number 2, second reason, if the U.S. is sincere about at least creating the conditions for some sort of a peaceful resolution between the 2 sides. The idea of whether it's the Ma administration or whether it's the Tsai administration today, of actually sitting down in earnest with the tables imbalanced like this, sitting down across a negotiating table when the other side has all the chips in terms of legitimacy, international legitimacy, I think it puts them on the losing side. And so if the U.S. was sincere, I think they would do more to gradually think about ways to be able to sort of soft balancing, using Russell's term there, as used before. The idea of thinking about soft balancing the Taiwan Strait, I think, is worth considering. And the third reason is just simply legitimacy. Is it any wonder, if I'm not mistaken, Freedom House has discussed some of the back steps in terms of democracies around the world. And whenever the U.S. on a daily basis extends legitimacy to the Chinese Communist Party and withholds legitimacy from a democracy, what signals does this send to the rest of the world? I would leave it at that, just thinking about different options.
Mark, that's a great thought to leave us with. We're going to move now to another one of the United States partners and allies in the region, mainly Japan. Kuniko Ashizawa here is going to discuss implications for the Northeast Asian region and East Asia in general, and potentially we'll talk about implications for Southeast Asia if there's time. So, yeah.
When I was asked to join this conference, the original question I was asked to think about regional implication or the response from the region of Asia. I mean, including like a peripheral region. I mean, peripheral region like Mongolia or Tibet, to the possible collapse of CCP. And this is such a big question that I think no single person can answer. So I negotiated with the staff from this project, and then I kind of decided, asked to narrow this focus. And then because my focus is Japanese foreign policy, but also regional institution building in Asia Pacific. So I would primarily focus on the Japanese, possible Japanese response to the collapse of the CCP, and then also the Korean Peninsula, and in Southeast Asian kind of regions. And then, of course, this is a really kind of hard question to answer, particularly for academics. As you know, the academics would not do, we kind of tend to kind of eschew from predictions. And then also, particularly international relations scholars has been not so good at to kind of predict for the major kind of change in international affairs. So, but I kind of found this is quite interesting exercise. And then, as Emily said, it's kind of interesting thought experiment. So I really thank to the organizer for these opportunities. And then, so what Japan would likely do in the event of the collapse of the CCP. I'm sure you have some kind of, you may have some ideas, right? Or maybe you may not. But the first question, this question kind of reminds me my kind of earlier kind of discussion with the Japanese policymakers, diplomats, and Japanese scholars over the 15 years, right, about Japan-China relationship. And that's like a more casual conversation. Often, those are casual conversations. But when we are discussing about the future of the Japan-Chinese relationship, those Japanese policymakers, foreign policy specialists tend to say, yeah, if China becomes democracy, then yeah, all kind of our headaches kind of would go on, right? So I mean, for that case, I think the typical kind of democratic peace theory, which is academic jargon, but democracy rarely goes to each other, appears to be kind of functioning, kind of in place in at least the Japanese foreign policymakers' thinking. But of course, I mean, this is kind of, first of all, it's kind of really hard to imagine, first of all, to the collapse of the CCP, or the fall of CCP. And also, it's really hard to imagine the way that the collapse of the CCP would lead to the kind of democratic transition, or see the rise of the democracy in China. And then, of course, the more likely scenario, if the CCP would be in kind of crisis, then the likely scenario would be kind of the instability in Beijing control, and then also the instability of all China. And then see that would probably go through the transitional period to maybe the rise of another kind of authoritarian state, or maybe the disintegration of China, or maybe the possibility to see the kind of rise of the democratic states in China. But in any way, see, it would go through kind of instability in China. And then that would kind of bring us probably the well-known historical kind of case, what Japan did do when the Asian continent, or China itself, was kind of the political organization or institution of the China was about to collapse, or collapsed. And then this is quite kind of interesting, but also disturbing historical precedent, as you know, in this particular context. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, the Japan kind of observed the kind of the collapse of the Qin dynasty, which was really kind of standing the political institution of China for a long time. And what Japan did, Japanese responses, as you know, basically the expansion into China, kind of physical, political, and then economic, and also militarily expansion into China, basically the Asian continent through Korean Peninsula and Manchuria, Northeast Asia, northeast part of China, and the establishment of the Manchukuo, the Japanese puppet country in Northeast Asia, and then decades-long Sino-Japanese war, and that would kind of eventually lead to the outbreak of the World War II. It's not actually a great picture. And underlying kind of the rationale for the Japanese military, Japanese government at the time is indeed to stabilize the China. In the Japanese kind of the leadership. the Japanese policymakers at the time really scared. They really worried about this kind of disintegration or instability on the mainland China. And then they became quite aggressive to kind of contain that kind of the instability that would be arising from the mainland China. And then they were worried about that kind of spread, ramification to Japan. And that was actually real fears the Japanese policymakers had at the time. And of course, the economic imperialist kind of expansion idea was also kind of in place in Japanese thinking. And that kind of turned into the idea of the creation of the Japanese-led regional order, which is called Great East Asian Co-Prosperity Sphere. So that was the idea kind of that driven the Japanese, the response to the collapse of the Chinese political order at the time. It was a disaster, of course. And then so our question is, will Japan do it again? I mean, when the Japanese leader began to see the collapse of the CCP and the instability of China. There's a little bit worrying some elements in the Japanese current political discourse in Japanese society. There's a kind of rise of that kind of revisionist, historical revisionism in China, and that kind of tends to romanticize the imperial past of Japan. And also, I mean, the Japanese, Chinese kind of the more like populist antagonism or kind of negative attitude became quite significant these days. I mean, last year's opinion poll, 90% of Japanese population, general population, see the Chinese as a kind of negative way. So there's a little bit worrying kind of the aspects of in the current Japanese situation in terms of this question, how Japan would respond. But I think in the end, if you look at all different kind of factors, Japan will not probably do the same things, right, in the early 20th century. And then they will not do territorial imperial expansion to take over China. That was kind of highly unlikely because of the U.S.-Japan alliance, which is kind of the new development after the World War II. So the Japanese foreign policy has been, and it will likely be in kind of line with U.S. policy vis-a-vis kind of the Chinese situation. Also Japanese economic decline has been a little bit kind of well known over the past decades. That would also kind of discourage Japanese policymakers to take the same kind of position vis-a-vis China or disintegration of China in early 20th century. And also negative historical lessons were all kind of learned among the Japanese policymakers. So it was kind of highly unlikely that Japan would do that. However, there would be some kind of new, interesting response from the Japanese side, Japanese policymakers in terms of economic and diplomatic expansion or engagement to probably selective areas of China, not the kind of the all kind of overall China as Japan did in early 20th century. They're going to probably choose some of the regions like the Darien or like former Manchurian regions or Shandong kind of peninsula nearby like Qingdao or Shanghai and Guangdong kind of regions to kind of the focus on some like a really viable economic kind of coastal states, and then to kind of help or they provide support, particularly economic support, for those particular cities and regions to manage the instability in Asia. So it will be like a little bit like more like a benign and then limited version of the greater East Asian co-prosperity kind of sphere. It kind of making like a network rather than sphere, and then linking some like East Asia kind of coastal cities of China and economically to Japan and then South Korea. So that kind of response could be, I think, expected. And then, and I'm going to do a little bit the kind of note on the Korean Peninsula. And historically, I mean, instability of China really resonated in Korean, or the Korean Peninsula. So I mean, basically leaving the Korean really helpless and then suffering. And of course, the North Korean kind of response or kind of implication for the North Korean of the Chinese, the collapse of the CCP would be really hard to predict, right? But it would be like, probably North Korea would be really serious trouble economically, and then maybe shifting toward more the forging relationship with Russia. If that's the case, I think South Korea would likely preoccupied with North Korean situation. And then although I think South Korea has become such a viable economy, and then also kind of began to kind of position itself as a quite kind of important country, which has a really deep knowledge about China, and they kind of they present themselves as they really know how to deal with China. So they want to maybe play a little bit more positive role for that, bring stability in China. But that would be kind of hard for South Korea if that South Korea would kind of preoccupied with North Korean situation. So for this case, I would kind of expect that maybe this is like a more prediction. It's like a more policy prediction rather than like a prediction. But maybe the South Korea and maybe Japan also would collaborate to supporting. South Korea would be in line with the Japanese kind of approach to China, at least to supporting or providing some kind of assistance to those coastal kind of economic viable kind of cities in China to help at least manage the destabilization of China. The last is the Southeast Asia. I'm going to do like 30 seconds. It could be kind of interesting. There's another historical kind of the analogy that it can be kind of drawn from Southeast Asian experience with that kind of class and the rise of the instability in that kind of region or around the region. In the late 1960s, when the Southeast Asian kind of countries began to see that more kind of growing instabilities in and around their regions, so because of the U.S. engagement in South Vietnam, U.S. hardship in Vietnam, and then kind of the upcoming prospect of the U.S. withdrawal from South Vietnam. That led ASEAN countries, Southeast Asian countries, to form ASEAN. So if the instabilities in China or their surrounding region, the ASEAN countries tend to kind of unite. And then last few years, because of China's expansion, particularly kind of Chinese kind of Belt and Road Initiative, indeed kind of led to the South ASEAN countries to be a little bit kind of disintegrated. The China's influence indeed divided, helped to divide Southeast ASEAN into kind of 3 blocks. And then that may be indeed kind of reversed because of this kind of the possible collapse of the CCP. And then that would bring indeed, the more kind of stronger ASEAN backing into this kind of political scene in East Asian countries. And that may also be playing interesting kind of partner with Japan and in South Korea and how to manage this, the kind of possible instabilities from China. Okay, so I'm going to stop here.
Thank you, Kaneko. I think it's really astute to use historical analogies to inform our thoughts on the future. So, but in lieu of my own question, because of time constraints, I'm going to just, we'll go 10 minutes beyond the original ending time, which was 4 o'clock, so we'll stay until 4:10. But I think we'll just go straight into questions for the audience. So I'll take 3 at a time. Please state your name and affiliation, and just limit it to 1 question per person, please. Gentleman back there.
Hi, Russell Shell with the Global Taiwan Institute and formerly with Project 2049. My question is for Mark, and then this is the flip side of Emily's question, really, is instead of what the U.S. can be doing to sort of prepare in policy-wise to sort of prepare for this potential eventuality, what can Taiwan be doing? Well, what kind of policy, approaches can Taiwan take in order to, sort of prepare for this eventuality?
Great. Oh, we're going to take 3 at a time. Yes, in the front.
Hi, my name is Nicole Morgrad. I'm with the Uyghur Human Rights Project. My question is for Peter Mattis. I was wondering if you could share your thoughts about that political article that came out the other day about the CIA officer who was grabbed in Chengdu. What do you think the likelihood is if it was a local MSS branch acting under its own initiative versus orders from the top? And can we expect more of this sort of thing in the future? And what should our response be?
And yes, right there.
Hi, my name is Tom Hoffaker. I'm a student at Georgetown. So, Peter, you mentioned that the CCP had learned and implemented reforms in 1983. What lessons beyond those reforms from internal issues have the CCP, the MSS, other security organizations put in place, potentially not learned from China, but from other countries? So whether that's USSR, other authoritarian regimes, what changes have they made over time?
Yours, Mark. So going back to what policy approaches can Taiwan take in a future collapse scenario?
Well, just in terms of in the practical world today, I would argue keep thriving as an open society and a democracy. Keep sort of working and improving that. Reaching out to various organizations in the U.S. Carefully, whether it's National Endowment for Democracy, Freedom House, other and within civil society, to be able to ensure people know that they exist. Whatever's done in the future, don't get anybody killed in the process. However, they determine their own fate. And on the issue of actually democracy promotion inside China, one of the best ways that I think that Taiwan can do it is as an example, being very very careful on dealing with this issue inside China itself, avoiding and giving them an excuse to sort of to blame Taiwan as a scapegoat. If I can just one other quick thing to throw out here. If I can sort of give a shout out to both, if you haven't read it, both some of the David Shambaugh's work from a couple years ago, and none other than our esteemed Peter Mattis here, who wrote an absolutely fantastic piece a few years ago called "Preparing for China's Collapse." And I would just one quote from it: "Collapse of the world's second largest economy and nuclear power is no small thing." That's Peter Mattis.
Peter, do you want to touch on your two questions? The first one about the political article, and the second about changes other states have made over time with their security apparatus.
So, with respect to the MSS picking up an accredited State Department official with diplomatic immunity, I think it's a fairly clear violation of the Vienna Convention. And it's not really clear historically what is the appropriate response to those kinds of things, other than to say that nothing. The United States doesn't really believe in reciprocity on those kinds of things. Because someone was beaten up doesn't mean we beat them up over here. So I think it requires a little bit of thinking through, but it's not one of those things of simply staying quiet and hoping that it doesn't happen again. Whether it's a local initiative or a central one, I think that sort of misjudges the way control is exercised or directions are given. It's simply much harder for anyone to say no to doing something like that in the Chinese system right now. That there's a lot more freedom to be tougher on whoever, whether it's a rights lawyer, an activist, a State Department official, ostensibly CIA having a meeting. Because the tools that you have for intimidation, if you're a state security service, are not, in some sense, not that much. So it does have to get physical. It does have to get ugly if you're going to try to deter and desist. And frankly, it's a little bit above board. It's one thing to do that to someone who's not accredited, but this is a diplomatic convention. It's probably one of the oldest international treaties that's still in force. And this is kind of a big deal. So nothing is the easiest response. Other changes that public security and state security have learned over time is that first, they need to be much better at tracking movement across jurisdictions. And this is one of the pieces of the Golden Shield project, which is that every time that you buy a train ticket, check into a hotel, get an airplane ticket, whatever else, it's being entered into the system and it's generating a report at the other end, at the location or the destination, saying this person is coming here, if you're on that list. So that a task is now automatically generated for the local public security or state security to go check in. And because you're generating a task, you're creating something that someone has to say yes or no, we did it or didn't do it. And so you can now measure whether or not a public security bureau is doing its job with respect to sort of surveillance reports or checking in. The longer version of that is to read James Q. Wilson's book on organizations called Bureaucracy, that sort of explains how there are second and third order effects of these kinds of things. The second major one is thinking not about how to take care of large demonstrations, but how to target the people that are going to connect those large demonstrations, which is somewhat connected to this issue of tracking people across jurisdictions. When you look at when Liu Xiaobo was finally arrested for good, and a number of other dissidents that were arrested for good and have remained in detention or prison, it's because they were often acting across jurisdictional lines, demonstrating that, well, look, this problem with school construction in Sichuan is the same problem that's there in Jiangsu and Zhejiang and Shanghai, and trying to show that these are not just local problems, but these are connective problems. And if you can target those connectors and keep them out, then your crises are going to be local rather than national, and preventing that from sort of cascading across each other. And again, getting to that point where you have to say, are we going to shoot people or not? And the final one is the social credit system, which is taking a lot of this other data that's been collected and building it into, how people are able to access finance and money and otherwise take care of things. But all of these things are enabled by technology, and in some ways, when you look at them in their totality, it's not that these are actually security measures so much as they are by technology and sort of behavioral science trying to reshape behavior in the absence of mass line and mobilization politics. And again, I have to say, read Samantha Hoffman's work on this because it's the only thing out there that connects all of these different pieces.
Anybody have a question regarding the role of or implications for states in East Asia? Yes, Rachel.
Hi, my question is for Kaneko. And Yang Jinli had talked about the importance of international recognition and support of any type of democratic movement or people's movement. And I know after the Tiananmen massacre and the Tiananmen incident that Japan was also one of the first countries that went in to maintain relations, to maintain the economic relations, to maintain stability. And the same thing happened I think back in the 80s as well. And so I wanted to ask, in the context of that, in a future scenario, if there is any type of collapse, and I understand Japan government's interest in maintaining stability and maintaining the coastal routes and the economic routes there, but would there be any willingness to support the actual movement itself, the actual ideals and the values of of freedoms and prosperities that the Japanese people themselves have?
There is a kind of generational change in Japanese foreign policy kind of makers' thinking. So it used to be see Japanese policymakers tend to shy away from the democratic promotion in Asia or Southeast East Asian countries in general. And that may be reflected in the Japanese response to the Tiananmen crisis, 1889. But I think that a new kind of generation of Japanese policymakers began to embrace more the importance of the democracy promotion or human rights promotion abroad. But I think in terms of the case of China, I think they will be still really cautious about the kind of overt kind of activism in terms of promotion or helping the democratic movement in China. I think what probably Japan would likely to do is in kind of more coordination with United States if the United States would go for some kind of supporting some kind of political movement or democratic movement in China, and then I think probably Japan would likely to coordinate with the United States or maybe also kind of Korea, and then in providing some kind of coordinated support toward that kind of new movement. I think that Japan would not go alone or unilaterally for that particular agenda.
I have a question for Peter. So, Peter, if the key to the survival of the CCP is the loyalty of the military and the other security services, and you think through what tools we have to impact that, we have this very robust mill-to-mill relationship. Now, when we started to develop the mill-to-mill relationship, one of the pillars of it we talked about was shaping perceptions, right? Generally, we meant bolstering our deterrence and those kind of perceptions. But we also, in the early days, talked about exposing them to our system of governance, our way of life, our values, and impacting them that way. Do you see, given this tool, it's a very robust relationship, is there a role for mill-to-mill in trying to get at this question of how they perceive their own government, how they perceive the durability of their own system, et cetera?
Possibly. But I think it goes to one of Ken Allen's major points. The more you know about the PLA before you talk to the PLA, the more you get from them. And there's no evidence in any sort of suggest that our knowledge of the PLA is anything like the systematic nature that we would need to have in that kind of engagement to have that kind of impact. So that would be sort of the biggest piece. If we don't have that, all of the rest of the tools aren't really effective in that context.
Yeah, we'll do just one last question and then we'll wrap up for today.
Mark, I want to have some comment on the. Some experts say the South China Sea issue will be the hardest, most complicated problem for the region. My gosh, North Korean crisis is complicated enough. I mean, I can't even imagine what he meant. But anyway, can you comment on that?
I sometimes like to use the analogy of third grade soccer. Yeah, third grade soccer players, they tend to sort of run wherever the ball is, they kind of run to without thinking about strategy very much. I tend to liken South China Sea to a third grade soccer game. I mean, it's important. There's no question. But my impression is that from Beijing's perspective, it's Taiwan. Because of the issue I mentioned before, it's about this legitimacy issue. And even in DoD reports to Congress, Taiwan remains the main strategic direction. South China Sea, when you think of scenarios there are off ramps everywhere. They can ratchet things up, they can ratchet things down. These days, in the Senkaku areas, it's kind of very quiet. Really, there hasn't been much flare-ups, at least in relative sense, what it was before. It just seems there's an ability to be able to ratchet things up and ratchet things down. I think, but underneath, when you look at various scenarios, I think Taiwan remains at a minimum. I think Beijing is intent on its one country, two systems approach, which is there's one China. Taiwan's part of China. The PRC is still representative of China in the international community, and seeing that through to its trying to implement that in every way that they can, particularly internationally, to me is what they appear to be doing. There's even relevance of South China Sea with regards to Taiwan, bearing in mind that the ROCs, some of the original claims actually have roots in the ROC dating back to the 40s.
All right, so with that, we will finish today. I would first like to give a round of applause for our distinguished speakers. Thank you for... And we just hope that our conference today provided a space and opportunity to think openly about all the possible future scenarios with the ultimate aim of ensuring the peace and prosperity of the Asia-Pacific region for the coming decades. So thank you very much for spending your time with us this afternoon, and we hope to see you again soon.